Criminal defense attorney Pat Harris has defended some famous and infamous clients over the years, and that experience has showed him how the law works and sometimes doesn't. And here is the co-author of Mistrial, an inside look at how the criminal justice system works and sometimes doesn't. Here's Pat Harris. Good to meet you.
Great. It's great to meet you, Steve.
Can I just say off the top here, we are going to talk about the book, but I just found out 5 minutes ago that you're married to one of my favorite singers of all time, Carol Welsman, who's from Toronto.
She is from Toronto. That's my Toronto connection. She is the talented one in the family, fortunately. In fact, I told her I'm happy to retire any day and let her support me.
I'll bet. Well, you do okay, because I know she's very successful. We've had her on this program probably 3 times, and we're huge fans anyway, so that's nice to know.
She is terrific.
Okay, let's talk about the law in your country, which, as we have come to discover, is very different from the law in our country. How much faith did you have in the U.S. justice system when you first began practicing law? How many years ago?
I actually first started about 25 years ago.
What'd you think back then?
Well, I had grown up, my grandfather was actually a judge and a lawyer in a small town in Arkansas. And for those people who've seen the movie or read the book To Kill a Mockingbird, he was very much sort of the Atticus Finch type. People would come pay him in chickens and they'd give him bushels of beans. That's how they would actually pay him. He did a lot of cases for free. So I grew up with this image of the justice system and being a lawyer is this very admirable sort of thing to aspire to. And it was amazing to me that by the time I actually got practicing law, the criminal defense attorneys, which is what I largely do, had now turned into sleazebags and the scum of the earth and that kind of thing. So it did, when I got into the system and started seeing sort of how defense attorneys were treated, it was kind of a rude awakening for me.
How long did it take before you realized that this entire justice system is not quite To Kill a Mockingbird?
I would say that probably came fairly quickly. My first job was in the public defender's office in Nashville, and the first day I went to work, I walked into a courthouse. My supervisor took me to a courthouse, put me in a courtroom, handed me 25 warrants for 25 clients and said, good luck. And you got the impression very early on, you knew that there wasn't much you could do. You literally had 10 to 15 minutes for some of these clients, and if the poor get charged, that they just weren't going to be represented very well, and it was a very frightening thing. So I learned literally my first day that the system is not what it's portrayed as.
Well, we know today that if anybody, be it a judge, be it a district attorney, if anybody wants to get elected to anything in the United States, you have got to be seen as being massively tough on crime. Mm-hmm. And I wonder, was it always thus?
It wasn't always thus. It was started in the late 1960s with Richard Nixon. He garnered some success by going after judges, but the real apex occurred in the election with Michael Dukakis when they ran a commercial. George Bush ran a commercial with a character named Willie Horton, some people may remember, who was a very unsavory looking character. And they ran this commercial repeatedly saying that Michael Dukakis was soft on crime, and they used Willie Horton as an example of a man who had been let out and then gone on to attack somebody after Dukakis had given him a pardon. And that was sort of the beginning when it became so successful, and it actually most people, at least a lot of people, gave credit to that commercial for helping to elect Bush. Then you started seeing politicians repeat it over and over, and it became almost an anthem of that too many politicians and judges are soft on crime. And that's the impression the Americans got of the judicial system. We're running rampant, letting murderers and rapists and all these people out of jail for no reason.
I think the irony of that case was that Dukakis was a Democrat, but the program was brought in by his Republican predecessor.
That's exactly right.
And yet he got nailed on it.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
To what extent do you think that soft on crime is, overwhelmingly a part of U.S. politics today?
Oh, I think it's a huge part of it. I talk about in the book that pretty much if any campaign, and even down to the most silly sort of people running for tax assessor, feel the need to run this commercial where it starts off with they're in the backyard with their wife and 3 kids and the 2 golden retrievers, and they're all bouncing around on the nice clean lawn and barbecuing and having a great time, and then the music turns sort of ominous and says, and if we're going to want to keep our children safe, we've got to start locking up these criminals out there who are running loose in the streets, and the judges and the liberal system going on in the courts. And then they show the picture of the candidate standing in front of a jail cell, and the door slams shut with a loud clang.
You've seen these ads before.
Oh, it's repeated over and over and over. You can almost do them in your sleep. And it's gotten to the point where that's just a standard of the campaign.
Okay, but here's where I come in and say, yes, but
Okay.
we appreciate that you represent defendants more often than not. And people, frankly, hate crime. I know the statistics say that crime is going down, but one murder's too many, and nobody wants to be in the wrong place in the wrong time. And damn it all, why should we have to put up with criminals?
Well, here's the problem. There is no question that there are a lot of defendants that I represent who are guilty. We know that going in, and we know that our job is to try and basically put the prosecutor to the test, make the prosecutor prove the case. That's our job. The problem we run into is, given what's going on with our society and the police agencies and this desire to sort of fight crime, a number of people who aren't criminals are getting caught up in the system, getting charged, and we're seeing repeatedly, in fact, it's almost a daily occurrence in the U.S., that you'll open up a newspaper and somebody in somewhere in some state has been released because of DNA evidence that showed they were innocent.
But people don't believe that. People believe that if the cops have charged you, you must have done something wrong.
And that's the problem we face. On a daily basis, when we go into court, one of the first questions we ask when we're doing questioning the jury is we'll say, my defendant's sitting here, my client's sitting here. Because he's sitting here, do you feel like where there's smoke, there's fire? He must be guilty just because he's here. 25 years ago when I started, you might get a few people who would raise their hand. Now you get 30 to 40% of them will raise their hand and say, oh yeah, if he's here, if the police arrested him, he did something. At the very least, he's some sort of a sleazebag, or he wouldn't be sitting next to you. So it's become ingrained in the system that just because they are there, they're guilty. And it is ironic. It's exactly what you said. It's ironic for us that in an age when every day you're seeing people being let out of jail because they've been proven by DNA to be innocent, that people are coming into courtrooms more convinced than ever that the system is infallible.
No, fair enough, but is it also not true? I mean, you know these people, you represent them, you defend them. Is it not also true that while they may not be guilty of whatever it is they're in that court for that day, they probably did something somewhere in their past, somewhere along the line, that they might have skated on or got away with, and therefore what goes around comes around?
There's a lot of that feeling, and there's a lot of that feeling by jurors.
Not true, though?
I don't think...
It's a bit true, eh?
I'll tell you what it is. When I was a public defender, I think that was true of most of my clients, because when you have poor, indigent clients, they tend to be repeat offenders. They tend to be people who've got records. However, once I went into private practice, I would say a majority of our clients have never been arrested for anything. They have no record. You get people, for example, in white-collar crimes, you get people who a lot of what we get are crimes of passion, which is sort of an American thing where, because we are so fond of our guns, that whenever people get into a fight or get into a horrible argument, they'll pull out a gun and shoot somebody, sometimes killing them, sometimes just hurting them, wounding them. But what you get a lot of is these people, it's the only time they've done anything like that. And unfortunately, it's just because they've lost a temper or they've had a moment. In fact, in the U.S., we have a common sort of case where a man comes home, finds his wife in bed with somebody else, and if you, at that point, actually shoot them, you get a lesser degree of murder. It's second degree instead of first degree.
Seriously?
Yes. It's actually taught in law school that's the common example of a second degree, because we call heat of passion. You don't see that in a lot of countries. You don't see, because most countries don't have the access to guns we do. So, for example, if you come home, somebody's in bed with your wife, the fact that you have a gun, you're so furious, you're obviously just going to be beside yourself, and you have access to a gun.
So it's not premeditated, therefore
premeditated.
A lesser charge.
Yes.
Okay. I mentioned off the top that our justice systems are very different, yours and mine. And I think the biggest difference is probably you elect some of your judges, and we find that, I think I'm on solid ground in saying that Canadians find the notion of electing their judges crazy. What do you think?
I think it is crazy.
You do too?
Yes. In the book, we talk about one of the reforms that's got to happen is that judges, we cannot continue to elect judges. Judges are now in the spotlight. They are now part of the media scrum, because the courts are now being covered like never before, especially in these high-profile cases. But what we have are judges who are scared to act now, because they know that if they just are quiet, they take the prosecution's side, they don't let people out of jail on bail, that they're never going to end up on the front page of the LA Times or the New York Times or whatever as having released a potential murderer. So if you just do your job by keeping people in, you're going to get reelected. If you, however, take a risk, if you do anything sort of pro-defense and it backfires, you're going to end up on the front page of the LA Times, and your chances of getting reelected have just been diminished.
Anybody in the United States at a political level reconsidering the wisdom of electing judges as opposed to appointing them?
It's not really something that's on the table very much. It's so ingrained in a lot of states at this point, and I think the biggest problem is the alternative is appointing judges, and it's not a perfect system by any stretch. Appointing judges has its own drawbacks, but it's better, and it's a better system, and we need to go to it, but it's not really something that's on the table right now.
Surely you'd have more judicial independence if you were appointed as opposed to elected.
And that's why the Founding Fathers, federal judges and Supreme Court justices are appointed. They had the wisdom to do that. Then when it was left up to the individual states, many of the states decided to elect them.
Prosecutors, do they see their job as convict, win at all costs, regardless of what the evidence says?
That's become the norm more than it used to be.
That's the norm now?
It is the norm now, and it's understandable for many of them because, like anybody, a prosecutor wants to do a good job and wants to be promoted. They want to move up, get the plum jobs, get their salary increased, and in order to do that, they've got to win. There was I hate to sound, I'm starting to sound like an old fogey, back in the good old days, but realistically, when we started, it was a badge of honor for a DA to have the courage to stand up and dismiss a case that he felt was not a good case. Now it's considered something of a disgrace. You fight regardless of what. You're considered almost a coward if you don't go forward and fight. And even if the case is not a good case, you should go ahead and try and win the case, because it's a win-at-all-cost system now. It's sad, but unfortunately that's the direction we've headed. And I don't see it changing anytime soon.
Let me explore that a little more with you, because you do mention some awfully tragic cases in the book where people have been put on trial, have been convicted on bad evidence, and the DA, even after the truth, quote unquote, comes forward, still won't apologize, won't recant, won't take a second look at the case. Where does that come from?
I tell you where it comes from, I believe, is there is this sort of ongoing, almost macho image that is partly created by the media in the U.S. of, again, win at all costs, and a prosecutor's weak if they lose or weak if they're not being tough on crime. And there's almost this feeling among prosecutors that any sign of weakness at all is a sign they're not a good prosecutor. And it's actually the opposite, because any sign of caring, a prosecutor's supposed to do justice. That's their job. It's not to win, it's to do justice. And they used to, at least, consider part of their job to investigate the case, make sure the case is good, get their police officers to go out and do interviews. Now they pretty much take what's given to them and, let's just go forward and win. And that's pretty much it.
Defense attorneys. Here we go, Pat. The assumption is, particularly in high-profile cases, which your law firm does a lot of, you've got the wind at your backs. You've got dream teams of lawyers, you've got jury selection specialists, you've got public relations teams, you've got high-priced multimillionaire lawyers going up against these poor district attorneys who are understaffed, under-resourced, taking on too many cases at once. And in fact, all of this notion of little old us defense attorneys and the power versus the power of the state is not true at all.
It's the exact opposite.
It is, eh?
It is. It's an amazing sort of, I think the Johnny Cochran, Robert Shapiro image of the O.J. case had a huge effect on the public and how they perceive these dream teams of lawyers and the money and everything that goes into a high-profile case. In fact, most clients, even the high-profile ones, do not have an unlimited budget or anywhere close to it, whereas the prosecutors have an unlimited budget, especially in high-profile cases. They're given a blank check. There's an old joke. A football coach an owner hired a football coach. He says, I gave him a blank check and he exceeded it. That's sort of the image of a lot of the prosecutors in these cases. They have the entire resources of the police. They can bring in other outside investigators. They can bring in lab technicians. They can bring in, the Scott Peterson case we use as an example in the book. They literally brought in 170 specific law enforcement officers from various different groups.
Just take a second, because many Canadians might not remember the Scott Peterson case. Just remind us.
The Scott Peterson case became infamous in the U.S. Scott Peterson was a late 20s fertilizer salesman in Modesto, California, with a very pretty wife named Lacey Peterson, who was pregnant. She was 8 months pregnant. She disappeared on Christmas Eve. He was charged with the murder. We represented him, and he was later found guilty and given the death penalty in the case. And it was an extraordinarily emotional case, and it, for whatever reason that no one really has ever been able to explain, it just took off in America and became almost an obsession.
Well, because it was I mean, at the risk of saying it, it was a heck of a juicy case. I mean, he was messing around with another woman at the same time, and
that's true.
And
but you know, it's funny because
they didn't like him.
Nobody liked him.
Nobody liked
that
him.
was amazing. He had the highest rate of just sheer people wanting to put him to death of any person we'd ever surveyed. But what's strange is in the U.S. there's 45 murders a day, and a number of those do in fact include couples, young couples. Sadly, you get situations like this where they get into fights or whatever, and somebody disappears or dies, and they don't get any publicity. And it struck a nerve somehow. And maybe the combination of being on Christmas Eve, the combination of she was a beautiful young lady, the pictures of her 8 months pregnant. Scott also sort of symbolized, we used to joke about our worst demographic were women between the ages of 20 and 45, because you would explain to them the evidence and you would say, well, you know, that part's not true and that part's not true and the things you believe are not true. And then they would just look at you and say, well, he reminds me of a boyfriend who cheated on me. And he sort of was that image of the cheating boyfriend or the cheating husband. And I think that played a large role in people just really hating him.
We may not have the evidence to convict you, but we don't like you.
We don't like you, exactly.
So you're going down. Okay, one more player in this judicial roster that we're looking at right now. Juries. Do you still have faith in the jury system?
That's a great question that Mark and I disagree on.
Mark is Mark Garagos, your co-author.
My co-author on it. Mark does. Mark is still a huge believer in the jury system. I have my doubts, and I've reached a point where there has been a proposal about 30 or 40 years ago that's kind of off the wall, but a proposal where we would actually start bringing in professional jurors, where you would go to college, then after you graduate, go to jury school for a year. You would learn the laws, you would learn the jury instructions, and then you would start doing misdemeanors and work your way up to felonies. And the concept is if you were a professional juror, you would get to see so many trials, you would begin to understand what is beyond a reasonable doubt, what's not. You would start understanding the jury instructions much, much better, because as opposed to somebody, you know, as we have now, just comes off the streets, never been in a courtroom, has no idea about the law and the instructions. I think it would be a cleaner system. It's probably a pipe dream. I don't think it will happen for 100 years, maybe never, but I think it would be, I actually would be in favor of it.
Okay, let's talk about public perceptions of the justice system in the U.S. now. And I just want to mention 2 letters of the alphabet. I suspect you know which letters they are. O and J, yes. Maybe the most famous man ever charged with murder in the history of the world. With the benefit of almost 20 years of hindsight right now, how do you think that case shaped public opinion of your judicial system?
Well, I think it tied in perfectly with what we talked about earlier with the Willie Horton and the idea that there were murderers being let loose. There was this whole sort of concept, as we were talking with politicians, saying we're soft on crime and murderers are going free. They're going into courts and being found not guilty by liberal judges. And then all of a sudden, here comes O.J. And it's the perfect sort of example of exactly what they're talking about. Here you've got a guy who was clearly guilty of murder, and what happened? He got set free. So here, you know, sure enough, the system is soft on crime, and sure enough, murderers are running loose in the streets and they're being let free. So I think it had an enormous impact from that standpoint of people just looking and saying, see, the politicians are all right, we are soft on crime. But beyond that, what O.J. did, and it's funny because I will still have jurors who to this day are so affected by O.J. that they will look at you and say, you'll tell them, well, you know, can you be fair? Can you judge correctly? And they will look at you and say no, and you'll say why? And they say, well, I think O.J. was guilty. I mean, 20 years later, a juror will look at you and say that has affected them so much that they still can't feel like they can be fair because of O.J.
And media coverage has changed hugely in the 20 years since that, almost 20 years since that case happened, right? What kind of an influence did it have on how the media covered courts?
Well, the media learned from O.J. It was actually a perfect storm because the media 24-hour news cycle was rising just about the time that O.J. came along. And what they learned very quickly is that anything O.J. related got ratings. And it created this whole atmosphere of we can take these high-profile cases and we can get ratings. Scott Peterson became the second huge example of that. So the media got involved, and there became this whole cottage industry of commentators. We refer to them in the book as the angry blonde white women, led by Nancy Grace, who I understand you guys have the pleasure of seeing in Canada as well.
Yep.
And it's sort of this group of people who came on screaming, starting with O.J., and then taking it a step further with every client who's charged is guilty, and how the system is geared against the prosecution, and all these sleazy defense attorneys are out there running around. And it has had an effect to the point where now we go into courtrooms, and when we ask the question about how many people do believe that the person sitting next to you, as I was saying earlier, guilty, you see huge percentages.
What did O.J. do in terms of the difference between the New York Times and the National Enquirer when it came to covering justice?
Sadly, the New York Times and the LA Times and some of the better papers, for the most part, they tried to stay out of the sewer. Sadly, they didn't always make it, because no matter what, even you would watch, NBC Nightly News, or you'd see Tom Brokaw or someone like that who you have great respect for and think. And sure enough, they're talking about what was O.J.'s, what did he have for dinner the last night he was out, or what was his friends, what are they running around doing? So even the great news organizations, the best news organizations, they realized that they had to get involved because there were ratings. I mean, it was something you could not ignore. And while I do think that the news media as a whole, the serious news media, does a good job of covering the courts, they're in a predicament because the tabloid news will pick up something, will run a story, they'll say something about, this client's confessed or something like that is not true, and then the serious news media has to make a choice. It's out there, people are talking about it, do we report it, or do we choose just to ignore it and have all the others, these tabloid news organizations, report it, and we look like we're not covering the story? It's a very tough call for them. And although I'm critical of the media at some points in the book, I actually do talk about, I believe overall the serious media does do a good job of covering the courts.
I do need to ask you this question. Did O.J. do it?
Sure.
Okay.
You're
a defense attorney, and you acknowledge he did it.
Oh, I don't think there was much question. I think that most people don't understand why he was found not guilty, and I think if you lived in Los Angeles, and especially if you're a defense attorney in Los Angeles, you understood why, because they moved the case to downtown LA, which was a huge mistake by the prosecution, and you moved it to neighborhoods near South Central where the jurors had bad experiences with LAPD, with the Los Angeles Police Department. And they had, for example, many of them had been pulled over, they'd been thrown on the ground, they'd had guns pointed to their heads. This was not an uncommon occurrence. They'd seen evidence planted against family members. They'd seen members shot for doing things that were, just running away. They had a very, very bad image, the jurors of the LAPD. So it was much easier to convince them that LAPD was going to plant evidence, that LAPD was going to lie. And by bringing in this jury pool from that area, it was clear, I think, to most defense attorneys what the verdict was going to be long before it came in.
Well, okay. You knew Johnny Cochran, right?
Yes.
He was in that chair about 16, 17 years ago. When I asked
When
I asked him if O.J. did it, he didn't say yes. He gave me a different answer from the one you just gave me.
He didn't say no, though, I bet.
You know what? You're right. He didn't actually say no. That's a good point. Yeah, because he couldn't lie, could he? At the end of the day, he couldn't lie.
No.
With every celebrity trial, Michael Jackson, Casey Anthony, the ones you have represented, is it now increasingly difficult to get a fair trial for these people because it has become such a media circus?
Yes and no. Celebrity has both its it's got both its positives and negatives. I always laugh. There was a movie with Peter O'Toole called My Favorite Year, in which he played a sort of an Errol Flynn type character. And they asked him, they said, what is it about being a celebrity? Is it tough? Is it easy? And he said, on the one hand, it's very, very hard because of what happens on a daily basis with me. People think I do things that I never did. On the other hand, I can get away with murder. And it's really, that's the case with celebrities. There are positives because people come in, they come in with preconceived notions, many times positive, like Michael Jackson. Most of the people came in with a positive preconceived notion. But then you have clients that it's the opposite. They come in with less than favorable opinions. But the problem with celebrity is that people in the end, this problem I would say for prosecutors is that people think they know these people. They think of them, they've been in my living room, and they can't picture them having committed something horrible. Robert Blake, for example, I mean, he was Beretta. He was, this guy wouldn't have killed somebody.
His wife.
His wife, exactly. And so for prosecutors, I think that's a real problem. And so celebrity does help in a lot of cases.
Pat, let's talk some politics. It seems every 4 years the issue of tort reform comes up in the United States, and presidential candidates are tripping over each other to promise tort reform, and then it never happens. And so somebody can go to some fast food place, I won't pick on anybody in particular, go to a fast food place, spill a little tea on their lap, sue the fast food place for burning them, and $1 million settlement comes down the pike. How come you can't make any progress on that issue?
Actually, tort reform is a sort of more of a state issue in most states, and there has been a lot of reform in states like Texas. George W. Bush actually ran on that when he was governor of Texas and made a lot of changes in tort reform there. The plaintiffs' bar in most states, the plaintiffs' lawyers, the one who brings the lawsuits, are powerful lobbying organizations, and they give a lot of money to the politicians. And the reason they give a lot of money to the politicians is to make sure that they don't reform it.
You probably do it too, right?
We do some plaintiffs' work. We actually do some plaintiff work. We have a lot of sympathy for the hot coffee and the
No,
and the
really,
ilk.
would you agree that's crazy?
Yes.
Spill hot coffee on yourself and get $1 million bucks?
It's actually different though than what people understood. And there's a documentary called Hot Coffee that talks about that. It was happening at McDonald's, and what wasn't told to the public is that McDonald's makes a decision, a corporate decision, to take their coffee up higher than Burger King and Taco Bell and all these places, to put it hotter, because what they've learned is that their customers, in fact, like hotter coffee, and that's why they would go to McDonald's instead. In return, they've talked to their legal experts, and they understand that they're going to be burns because it's hotter than other places, and they're going to have to pay out judgments when people get burned. So they make a conscious decision. Is the profit we're going to make by having hotter coffee worth it versus what we're going to pay out? So in essence, they knew well ahead of time when that woman got burned very badly. She had incredible, incredible scars. I mean, it was horrible. If you see the film of it, the pictures. They knew ahead of time they were going to have to pay out, but their public relations people went out and said, oh, this is horrible and all kinds of things. But in truth, McDonald's, that's a conscious choice they make. They said, we're going to do our coffee hotter. It's going to burn some people, but we're also going to make more sales because of it. So there's a second side of that story.
Of course, I appreciate that, but it does feel like personal responsibility is almost a swear word in your country nowadays, yeah?
Personal responsibility is now the code word that is used by prosecutors everywhere, because it is a term that's become very popular. No one will take personal responsibility. You're right.
Let's, in our last few minutes here, just talk about some of the more high-profile cases that you've been affiliated with. And the Michael Jackson one I found most fascinating because I think people acknowledge, whether you like his music or you don't, Michael Jackson was a musical genius.
Yes.
What I think people also suspect is that he's a complete nut job. But you recount a conversation that you guys had with him in the book where he came off as a smart, engaged, with it person, which would come as news to anybody who's seen that guy on TV giving some interviews. What do you know that we don't know about this guy?
Well, the first time we met him was actually the night that they had raided Neverland, and they were bringing the charges against him for child molestation in Santa Maria. We flew to Las Vegas. We eventually ended up getting into his hotel suite at about midnight. And we had a probably 1 hour conversation with him in which he was extraordinarily engaged. He would answer questions, he asked good questions, he came across as being very verbal. He had a lower baritone voice, not at all what you see on television or saw him on television. It was extraordinarily different from his television image. And when we left that night, when Mark and I left, we came away so impressed and thought, well, this is the guy that is the musical genius. This is what we see. Unfortunately, that is the last time we saw that. We were with him a number of other times, and we saw more of the detached, sort of staring into space, the person who wasn't really interested in engaging with us, talking with us. And I think a part of why Michael Jackson is who Michael Jackson is, when you reach the level of fame that he has in the world, when you get to that point where you are just astronomically famous, in some ways he wants to disconnect. He literally needs to disconnect from the world because he lives in a world that is just, it's unbelievable. And I think in some ways, whether it's through drugs, whether it's his own just sort of coping mechanism, he has learned to disengage. And part of what comes across as being a nut job, as you said, part of it comes across that is that just disengagement. He's in a world that none of the rest of us are in.
Thanks a lot for coming into TVO tonight.
It's been my pleasure.
Mistrial, an inside look at how the criminal justice system works and sometimes doesn't, by Pat Harris and his co-author Mark Garagos. Thanks, Pat.
Thank you.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.